February 28, 1997, the North Hollywood Shootout, a battle that transformed a bustling city into a war zone. Heavily armed criminals against outgunned police officers. The nation watched in horror as the events unfolded live on television. This is the story of that day. The San Fernando Valley, a sprawling suburb of Los Angeles, was bathed in the warm glow of a winter morning. Unbeknownst to its residents, two men were about to unleash chaos.
Larry Phillips Jr.
and Emil Matasareanu, career criminals, had been meticulously planning this day for months. Armed to the teeth with automatic weapons and clad in body armor, they were prepared for war. The clock ticked closer to 9:16 a.m., the moment Phillips and Matasareanu had chosen to strike. The calm before the storm was about to be shattered. At precisely 9:16 a.m., Phillips and Matasareanu stormed the Bank of America, their weapons blazing. Terrified customers and employees dove for cover as bullets ripped through the air.
The first police officers arrived on the scene within minutes. Two heavily armed men, seemingly impervious to their bullets, were unleashing a torrent of lead. The officers, outgunned and pinned down, fought back with desperate courage. News helicopters descended upon the scene, their cameras capturing the chaos below. The North Hollywood Shootout had begun.
The sun-drenched beaches and glitzy glamour of Los Angeles held a dark underbelly. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu, two men with troubled pasts, found each other.
Phillips, a high school dropout with a history of petty crime, was drawn to Matasareanu's aura of quiet intelligence.
Matasareanu, a Romanian immigrant with a degree in electronics, saw in Phillips a kindred spirit.
Their workouts became more intense, their conversations more secretive. Their friendship, fueled by paranoia and a shared sense of alienation, was a ticking time bomb. The line between fascination and obsession is often blurred. For Phillips and Matasareanu, their shared interest in firearms morphed into a dangerous obsession. They began to see themselves as soldiers in a private war against a corrupt world. Their apartments transformed into makeshift armories. They withdrew from friends and family, their world shrinking to encompass only each other and their shared obsession. Their grip on reality loosened, replaced by a dangerous delusion of grandeur. The transformation from petty criminals to hardened outlaws was complete. Phillips and Matasareanu now craved the adrenaline rush of high-stakes robbery. Their first target was an armored car in Littleton, Colorado. Armed with automatic weapons and clad in body armor, they ambushed the guards. Back in Los Angeles, they continued their reign of terror, hitting two more banks in the San Fernando Valley. They became known as the High-Incident Bandits. Months in the making, Phillips and Matasareanu's plan was meticulous. The Bank of America branch on Laurel Canyon Boulevard had become the focal point of their twisted ambition. They had acquired an arsenal that would rival a small army. Their body armor was designed to withstand anything the police could throw at them. They were prepared to turn the streets of North Hollywood into a war zone. Their plan hinged on speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence. They had convinced themselves that this was their destiny. The morning of February 28, 1997 dawned like any other in the San Fernando Valley.
Armed and clad in our makeshift armor, we climbed into our nondescript white Chevrolet Celebrity.
They arrived at the bank just after 9 a.m.
Inside the bank, employees and customers went about their daily routines.
They checked their watches, their movements synchronized.
I took a deep breath and nodded at Matasareanu.
They walked towards the bank, their shadows stretching out before them. The first sign of trouble came with a deafening roar, gunfire.
The initial police response was swift but wholly inadequate. Phillips and Matasareanu, their bodies shielded by their makeshift armor, seemed impervious to our bullets.
As the minutes ticked by, the situation spiraled out of control. News helicopters drawn to the scene by the escalating violence circled overhead. The LAPD, caught woefully unprepared, found themselves facing a desperate situation.
The officers, their training kicking in despite the overwhelming odds, sought what little cover they could find.
As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, a sense of dread settled over the scene. The robbers, their movements becoming increasingly erratic, seemed unstoppable. The police, their ranks swelling as reinforcements arrived, found themselves in a desperate race against time. They needed to find a way to neutralize the threat before more lives were lost. The incessant rattle of gunfire echoed through the streets.
With our backs against the wall, we resorted to desperate measures.
Recognizing the need for greater firepower, some officers made a daring dash to a nearby gun store. They emerged moments later, their arms laden with semi-automatic rifles.
As the minutes ticked by, our tactical command center scrambled to coordinate a response. SWAT teams, their specialized training and equipment finally deemed essential, raced towards the scene.
The arrival of the LAPD's elite SWAT team brought a much-needed boost to the morale of the outgunned officers. Armed with heavier weaponry and tactical gear, the SWAT team immediately went into action, their movements precise, their demeanor calm amidst the chaos.
Under the cover of armored vehicles, we began to establish a perimeter around the bank. Our objective was clear: contain the threat and neutralize the suspects.
The sound of their heavier weapons, a stark contrast to the pop-pop-pop of the robbers' automatic gunfire, offered a glimmer of hope to the terrified civilians trapped inside the bank and the officers pinned down in the street. The SWAT team's arrival also allowed for the evacuation of the wounded.
Paramedics, their ambulances unable to navigate the bullet-riddled streets, waited anxiously on the periphery. Their hands hovered over stretchers, their eyes scanning the scene for a break in the gunfire. Every wounded civilian, every injured officer, represented a small victory in a battle that seemed far from over.
Despite the SWAT team's arrival, Phillips and Matassarianu, their minds warped by a potent cocktail of adrenaline, paranoia, and delusion, showed no signs of backing down. They continued to fire indiscriminately, their bullets tearing through the air, their bodies seemingly impervious to the heavier rounds now being directed at them. The battle for North Hollywood was far from over. The arrival of the SWAT team and their heavier firepower marked a turning point in the battle for North Hollywood. The robbers, while still dangerous, were no longer able to move with impunity.
The LAPD, bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements and armed with weapons capable of piercing the robbers' body armor, began to gain the upper hand.
SWAT snipers, positioned on rooftops and behind barricades, began to target the robbers' exposed limbs, their shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Phillips, his movements hampered by a gunshot wound to his arm, began to show signs of fatigue, his once incessant gunfire becoming more sporadic.
Matassarianu, realizing that their escape was becoming increasingly unlikely, grew more desperate. He attempted to commandeer a civilian vehicle, his movements frantic, his eyes darting back and forth between the approaching police officers and the terrified driver. His attempts were met with a hail of gunfire, forcing him back behind the cover of his bullet-riddled getaway car.
The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the tension of a city on edge, crackled with anticipation. The robbers, their initial bravado replaced by a growing sense of desperation, were running out of options. The LAPD, their resolve hardened by the knowledge that lives were at stake, closed in, their movements deliberate, their determination unwavering. The North Hollywood Shootout, a chaotic ballet of bullets and blood, was nearing its bloody climax. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and the stench of fear, buzzed with a palpable tension. The LAPD, their ranks bolstered by SWAT teams and courageous patrol officers armed with borrowed rifles, had the robbers surrounded, their escape routes effectively cut off. Phillips, his movements hampered by a gunshot wound to his arm, stumbled through the parking lot. His body riddled with bullet wounds, his lifeblood staining the asphalt crimson. His eyes, once filled with a chilling intensity, now reflected a growing despair, a realization that his carefully crafted plan had unraveled. leaving him trapped and bleeding. Matassarianu, his face contorted in a mask of rage and desperation, continued to fire back at the police, his bullets tearing through the air, a desperate plea for a freedom he knew he would never see again. His body, once shielded by his makeshift armor, was now riddled with bullet wounds, his movements becoming increasingly erratic, his once indefatigable spirit slowly waning. The streets of North Hollywood, transformed into a war zone by the robbers' audacious attack, bore witness to the true cost of freedom. The LAPD officers, their faces etched with the stress of battle, their bodies weary from the relentless fight, were fighting not just for the lives of innocent civilians, but for their own survival, for the preservation of the delicate fabric of peace that held their city together. The final act of the North Hollywood shootout played out with a tragic inevitability, the culmination of a day that began with such misplaced ambition and spiraled into a maelstrom of violence and despair. Phillips, his body riddled with bullet wounds, his lifeblood staining the pavement, made his final stand. With a chilling calmness that belied the chaos swirling around him, Phillips placed the barrel of his pistol beneath his chin and pulled the trigger, ending his own life rather than face capture. The sound of the gunshot, a sharp crack that echoed through the air, brought a momentary hush to the scene, a brief respite from the relentless barrage of gunfire. Matassarianu, his body riddled with bullet wounds, his spirit broken, made a last desperate attempt to flee, his movements hampered by his injuries, his escape route blocked by a cordon of heavily armed police officers. He emerged from behind his bullet-riddled getaway car, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his voice hoarse, his pleas for mercy lost in the din of battle. The police, their fingers still twitching on their triggers, their bodies still thrumming with adrenaline, watched as Matassarianu, his body racked with pain, slumped to the ground, his lifeblood seeping into the asphalt, his reign of terror finally at an end. The echoes of gunfire faded into an eerie silence. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a grim testament to the violence that had just transpired. Phillips lay still, his body riddled with bullet wounds, his lifeblood staining the asphalt a macabre crimson. His eyes, once blazing with defiance, stared vacantly at the sky, his reign of terror finally over. Matassarianu, his body racked with pain, his spirit broken, lay sprawled on the pavement a few blocks away. His chest, once protected by his makeshift armor, was now a tapestry of bullet wounds, each one a testament to the futility of his desperate last stand. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his lifeblood seeping into the asphalt, each heartbeat a testament to the resilience of the human body, even in the face of overwhelming trauma. As the adrenaline that had fueled their rampage ebbed away, a chilling reality settled over the scene. The LAPD officers, their bodies weary from the relentless fight, their minds still reeling from the intensity of the gun battle, surveyed the carnage with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The streets of North Hollywood, once a bustling testament to the California dream, now resembled a war-torn city, the aftermath of a battle fought with a ferocity that belied its suburban setting. Shattered glass crunched underfoot, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the devastated streetscape, the enormity of what had transpired began to sink in. The North Hollywood shootout, a 44-minute firefight that had captivated a nation, was over.
The body count, while mercifully low, was a stark reminder of the human cost of violence.
The shootout exposed a glaring vulnerability in law enforcement's ability to combat heavily armed criminals.
In the aftermath, the LAPD embarked on a crash program to upgrade their firepower and tactical training.
The North Hollywood shootout was a watershed moment in American law enforcement history. It forced police departments to confront a chilling reality. Criminals were becoming increasingly brazen and heavily armed. The images of that day, broadcast live, seared into the collective consciousness. In the aftermath, a wave of change swept through law enforcement agencies. The LAPD became a model for enhancing firepower and tactical training. The shootout sparked a national debate about gun control. The echoes of gunfire continued to reverberate through the halls of justice. The North Hollywood shootout was a tragedy and a catalyst for change.